Wyatt Brennan's boots struck the dirt hard, each step pulling him closer to town, but the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than the miles he'd traveled. The Texas sun was relentless, the dry air making the horizon shimmer like a mirage. He had come into Dusty Springs for flour and coffee, simple things that didn't matter much in a world that had been stripped of peace. He didn't care much for the town, or the people, or the life he left behind when he joined the Union Army 6 years ago. But today, as the town came into view, it wasn't just the usual sting of loneliness that gnawed at him. There was a different pull, a quiet voice buried deep in his chest, urging him forward. His horse, a gray mare named Mercy, limped beside him, the long journey taking its toll on the old animal. She'd begun favoring her left leg midday, but Wyatt wasn't about to stop for a rest. He never stopped anymore. He couldn't afford to. He had buried his past, along with the woman he'd once promised everything to. Sarah. The memory was a distant ache in his chest, something he had learned to ignore as he kept riding through the years. He'd gone to war, been hardened by battle, and when it was over, he had never found his way back home. The town's few buildings appeared through the haze of the midday heat. A bank, a saloon, a crooked church with a bent steeple. But his eyes landed on the Whitmore boarding house, a 2-story frame structure at the end of the main street. The sight of it pulled him in. His stomach growled, but there was something else he needed here, something he didn't even understand yet. He was halfway down the main street when the glass shattered. A woman's scream cut through the quiet afternoon, raw and desperate. Wyatt's hand went to the Colt at his hip, his instincts kicking in as his boots carried him forward without hesitation. Another man's voice, rough and dripping with liquor, followed. "I said you're going to sign it, Clara. One way or another you're going to sign." Wyatt's feet faltered for a moment. He could feel the tension hanging in the air, the kind of tension that stirred something in the pit of his stomach. He told himself not to get involved. This wasn't his fight. But before his mind could finish the thought, his feet were already moving toward the broken door of the Whitmore boarding house. Inside, chaos unfolded before him. The parlor was wrecked. Overturned chairs and glass scattered across the floor. A woman, small but fierce, was backed into a corner, her hands struggling against a man twice her size, his grip tight around her throat. Her nails scraped his face, drawing blood, but the man only growled, unfazed. His silk vest and polished boots didn't belong in this dust-choked town. Neither did the gold chain at his waist. "I'm trying to be reasonable here, but you're making it awful hard," the man sneered, his hand tightening on the woman's throat. "Get your hands off me, Shaw. I'll never sign it." The woman's voice cracked, but she didn't beg. She didn't cry. She fought. Wyatt didn't know her, but there was something about her defiance that made his blood run cold. This wasn't just about land. This wasn't just about money. This was about something much darker. The man, Shaw, was big and had the look of someone who'd stopped doing his own dirty work a long time ago. He shoved the woman harder against the wall, ignoring her struggle, his voice cold and cruel. "I'm offering you a way out, widow. Take it. You sign the deed, take the money, and I'll let you walk away. Or I can make sure you don't get up again." "Get your hands off her." Wyatt's voice cut through the tension like a blade, flat and hard. The room went silent. The man turned, eyes narrowing as he sized up the newcomer. "This is private business, stranger." Shaw spat. "You don't belong here." Wyatt stood tall, his hand still resting on his gun. He could feel the weight of his old wounds, the ones that never really healed. But they were nothing compared to the rage that boiled in his chest now. He had seen men like Shaw before, men who thought they could buy everything, control everyone, break those too weak to fight back. Wyatt didn't flinch. "You're wrong," he said calmly. "This is my business now." Shaw's eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of doubt, but the sneer never left his face. He took a step back, releasing the woman, but not stepping away. He seemed to be measuring Wyatt, sizing him up as a threat. "You don't know who I am," Shaw growled. "I don't care," Wyatt replied, his voice low but certain. "But I know who you are, and I know what you're doing." The man's grin widened, but it was empty now, without the same confidence it had held before. "Then I guess you're just as stupid as you look," Shaw said, his hand reaching for his pistol. Wyatt moved faster, his Colt clearing leather in one fluid motion, the hammer clicking back with a sound that cracked through the room like thunder. Shaw froze. "Go ahead," Wyatt said quietly. "Finish the draw, see what happens." For a long moment, nobody moved. The room held its breath. Finally, Shaw's hand loosened, and he stepped back, his eyes flicking to the door. "You made a mistake, stranger. A big one," Shaw muttered, turning on his heel and walking toward the exit. Wyatt's gun stayed trained on him, his finger still resting on the trigger. "Walk away," Wyatt said. "Now." Shaw paused at the door, his eyes meeting Wyatt's one last time. "You'll regret this," Shaw sneered. "I'll make sure of it." Wyatt didn't answer. He didn't need to. As Shaw and his men retreated, Wyatt's eyes moved to the woman who had fought so fiercely for her life. She was breathing heavily, her hand pressed against her throat where Shaw's hand had been, but her eyes, brown and sharp, met his, and for the first time, something in her expression softened. Not gratitude, not relief, but something close. "You're all right?" Wyatt asked, his voice softer now. "I will be," she replied, pushing herself off the wall, though her hands trembled. She stood tall, defiant, and despite the blood on her skin and the terror in her eyes, she didn't back down. "But you shouldn't have done that. Marcus Shaw owns this town." "Doesn't matter," Wyatt said quietly. "Not anymore." She tilted her head, studying him. "Who are you?" "My name's Wyatt Brennan," he said, holstering his gun. "I was just passing through." "Well, Mr. Brennan, you should have kept passing," she said, her voice firm, but something else flickered in her eyes. Maybe curiosity. Maybe something more. Wyatt raised an eyebrow, watching her carefully. "Ma'am, you heard what he said. Shaw owns this town. He owns the sheriff, the bank, the law. He owns everyone who works for him." "I'm not asking for your help," she snapped, turning toward the wreckage of her home. She was strong, this one. Fiercely so. "But you just made yourself a target. And for what? For me?" Wyatt didn't have an answer, but he knew the truth. He hadn't done it for her, not at first, but standing here now, in the midst of the broken parlor, and the blood that still stained the walls, he wasn't so sure anymore. "No," he said, after a beat, "for what's right." Quote, the sun was setting when Wyatt left the boarding house, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders. The town was quieter now, the tension in the air thick, with the aftertaste of confrontation. He knew Shaw wasn't done. Men like that didn't walk away after a failed attempt. They came back harder. But for now, Wyatt had done what he came here to do. He wasn't sure why he'd stayed. Maybe it was the defiance in Clara's eyes, the way she fought like her life depended on it. Maybe it was the fact that he hadn't felt that alive in years. He leaned against the post of the porch, waiting for his horse to settle. His ribs ached, a constant reminder of the past that hadn't let him go. The war, the pain, the ghosts. He'd ridden through it all, never looking back, never letting anyone get close. But now, in the quiet of Dusty Springs, something had changed. The door of the boarding house creaked behind him. He turned, expecting to see Clara, but it was Daniel. The boy, barely 17, stood in the doorway, staring at him with wide eyes. "I thought you'd be gone by now," Daniel said, his voice tight. He looked as if he'd been pacing, his movements stiff, like he was holding something back. Wyatt straightened, meeting the boy's gaze. "I'm not going anywhere." Daniel shifted uneasily, glancing back toward the house. "Clara said you were just passing through." "Plans change," Wyatt replied simply, wiping a hand across his brow. "Sometimes you end up staying longer than you intend." Daniel didn't respond right away. He stood there for a moment, the silence thick between them. "You sure that's all there is to it?" Quote. Wyatt felt the question hanging in the air, sharp and unexpected. He didn't answer right away, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Daniel muttered, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Sometimes I think people don't know why they do what they do. Maybe they get caught up in it, in the moment, in the fight." Wyatt chuckled darkly, the sound hollow. "You're not wrong there, boy." Quote. Daniel eyed him closely, like he was trying to figure him out, trying to understand the man who had come into their lives so suddenly. "So you're gonna stay and help?" Wyatt met his eyes, holding the boy's gaze for a long moment. "I'll help, Daniel, in any way I can." The boy's face softened just a little, like he was relieved but still unsure. He nodded slowly, then turned and headed back into the house, the door creaking shut behind him. Wyatt stood for a while longer, the darkness creeping in as the last light of day faded. He didn't know why he'd stayed. He had no business being here, no business getting involved in the life of a widow who'd already lost so much. But there was something about this place, about Clara, that kept pulling him in, something familiar, and yet something completely foreign. The sound of hooves in the distance broke the stillness. Wyatt's hand instinctively went to the Colt at his side, but it wasn't Shaw's men. It wasn't anyone he recognized. The rider was alone, moving quickly, urgency in his every movement. Wyatt's pulse quickened, and his senses sharpened. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts. The rider came into view, a man dressed in rough clothes, his face drawn with exhaustion. As he drew closer, Wyatt's grip tightened on his gun. The man wasn't one of Shaw's men, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. He rode up to Wyatt, his horse lathered with sweat, eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Brennan," the man called out, his voice rough with weariness. "You're Wyatt Brennan, aren't you?" Wyatt stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "That's me." "What's going on?" The man slid off his horse, barely managing to stay upright. He took a deep breath, his words coming in a rush. "You don't know me, but I've heard your name around here. My name's Joseph McAllister. I'm from Miller's Creek. You need to come quick. There's something bad happening." Wyatt raised an eyebrow, his hand still on the Colt at his side. "What's bad?" Quote. McAllister's eyes flicked nervously toward the boarding house. "It's Shaw. He's got men. They're coming this way. I don't know why, but I saw them. They're heading toward Dusty Springs. I couldn't stop them." Wyatt's heart skipped a beat. "How many?" "5, maybe more, armed, coming fast." Wyatt cursed under his breath. He turned toward the house, thinking fast. "Get your horse. We need to move now." McAllister nodded and rushed to retrieve his horse. But Wyatt didn't wait. He jogged toward the front door of the boarding house, his heart pounding in his chest. He burst through the door, finding Clara sitting at the table, her hands trembling as she folded some old cloth. "Clara!" he called, his voice urgent. She looked up, startled, but when she saw his face, her eyes hardened, the same fierce determination he'd seen earlier in the parlor. "What is it?" she asked, standing up quickly, her gaze never leaving his. "Shaw's men are coming," Wyatt said, his voice tight with urgency. "We don't have much time." Clara stood taller, her body tense. "How many?" "At least 5, armed. They're coming for you." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't panic. She just nodded, her eyes dark with something Wyatt couldn't name. "Then we fight. We don't let them take this from us." Wyatt shook his head, feeling the tension in his chest tighten. "We're not going to be able to fight them all off. We need to get out of here. We need a plan." Clara's eyes locked onto his. "A plan? We don't have time for a plan, Wyatt. We're not running. Not anymore." Her words hit him like a slap. He could see it in her eyes, the fire that wouldn't die, the defiance that had kept her standing in the face of Shaw's threats. She wasn't running, and neither was he. "No," he said softly, his voice steady. "We don't." The sound of hooves grew louder, and Wyatt felt the familiar tension in his chest as he reached for his gun. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing and fighting. For a woman he barely knew. For a town that was on the brink of being swallowed whole by a monster. And for himself. Because, for the first time in years, Wyatt Brennan felt like he had something worth fighting for. Clara stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm with you," she said quietly. "Let's finish this." The night was still and heavy, thick with the promise of what was to come. Clara stood at the window, her hands pressed against the worn wood of the frame, her eyes scanning the horizon. She hadn't felt this kind of fear in years, but tonight it was different. Tonight it wasn't just about survival. It was about fighting back, about reclaiming what was hers, about standing strong against a man who thought he owned everything and everyone around him. Wyatt's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "We're not running. Not anymore." She turned away from the window as the sounds of activity filled the boarding house. Maggie and Daniel were preparing, gathering the supplies they could use. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread, a small comfort in the midst of chaos. But Clara couldn't focus on the smell of the bread or the flickering candlelight. She couldn't stop thinking about Wyatt's injury, the bullet that had grazed his side, the blood that had soaked into his shirt earlier. He'd insisted on staying, on helping, and now they were preparing for the battle they knew was coming. She had no illusions about what Shaw would do if he found them. He'd show no mercy. He never did. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of boots on the porch. She moved swiftly, her hand instinctively going to the shotgun she'd kept by the door ever since Shaw's men had first threatened her. But it wasn't Shaw's men. It was Wyatt, his silhouette dark against the dim light of the lanterns inside. "You should be resting," she said quietly, her voice sharp with concern as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I've rested enough," Wyatt replied, his voice hoarse but steady. He was carrying a rifle in one hand and his Colt at his side, both weapons ready. His eyes were tired, but there was no mistaking the intensity in them. The fire still burned there, deep and resolute. "We don't have much time." Clara studied him for a long moment, her brow furrowed. "You're still hurt." Wyatt shrugged, his jaw tightening slightly as he adjusted the rifle in his hand. "I'll be fine. We don't have the luxury of worrying about my injuries right now." She didn't say anything, but her eyes softened. She wanted to argue, to tell him to rest, to let her handle it. But she knew that wasn't an option. They were in this together now, and there was no turning back. "Where's Daniel?" Wyatt asked, breaking the silence. "Out back," Clara replied, her voice steady. "He's getting the others ready." Wyatt nodded. His eyes moved toward the kitchen, where Maggie was still working, humming softly as she gathered the remaining supplies. "Is she ready?" Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "As ready as she can be, but she's not going to back down." "No one here is going to back down," Wyatt said quietly, his voice carrying a quiet resolve. He met her eyes. "I won't let them take this from us, Clara, not while I'm breathing." She didn't know if it was the words or the weight behind them, but something inside her shifted. She'd heard men say the same thing before, had heard them promise they'd protect her, that they wouldn't let anything happen. But Wyatt, he wasn't like the others. There was something about him, something in the way he spoke and the way he held himself, that made her believe him. He wasn't here to save her. He was here because he had something to fight for, something worth standing for. And for the first time in years, Clara wasn't sure she was alone anymore. She reached out, her hand brushing his arm. The warmth of his skin against her fingertips sent a shiver through her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the connection between them. It was quiet, but strong. Unspoken, but real. "We'll make it through this," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Together." Wyatt's gaze softened, his hand coming up to rest over hers. Together. Just then, the door to the kitchen opened, and Daniel stepped inside, his face tight with concern but determined. "They're here." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Wyatt, and without another word, they both moved toward the door. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and heat, the wind rustling the leaves on the trees, but it did little to ease the tension in her chest. She could hear the sound of horses, their hooves pounding against the earth, and a dozen other noises she couldn't quite identify. The town was too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. "Stay close," Wyatt said, his voice low, "and stay down. We can't afford to give them a reason to shoot first." Clara nodded, her fingers curling around the shotgun as she followed him outside, her heart pounding in her chest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the street, and she could make out the shapes of men moving in the distance. Shaw's men. She didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. The way they carried themselves, The arrogance, the threat in their every movement, told her everything she needed to know. The door to the boarding house creaked shut behind her, and she took a step forward, her pulse quickening. Wyatt was already in position, his rifle aimed at the edge of the street where the men were coming from. He glanced back at her, his eyes scanning the area, calculating their next move. "I'll draw their attention," he said, his voice steady. "You get ready to cover us." Clara didn't argue. She knew the plan. She knew what she had to do. She had been preparing for this moment for far too long to hesitate now. Wyatt took a deep breath and stepped into the open, his rifle aimed at the men who were getting closer. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the only sound, the distant rustle of the wind, and the faint creaking of the boarding house. Then, the first rider emerged from the shadows. Clara's fingers tightened on the shotgun. "Shaw's men," Wyatt called, his voice steady. "This is the end of the line for you." The first man drew his gun. Wyatt didn't wait. He fired, the crack of the rifle splitting the silence. The man fell, his gun dropping to the ground. Clara moved, swift and silent, her heart pounding in her chest as she took her place. Another shot rang out, another man fell, and she saw Wyatt move to cover him, his focus unyielding, his determination unmistakable. The rest of Shaw's men scattered, unsure, as the fight erupted in full. The moon hung low above them, the night sky filled with gunfire and the sound of hooves pounding against the earth. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she fired her own shot, the kick of the shotgun sending a jolt through her body. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not now. The battle raged on, the sound of their guns ringing in the air as Wyatt and Clara held their ground. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt something stir in her chest, something that wasn't fear. It was hope. The silence after the last shot was almost unbearable. Clara stood there, chest heaving, the weight of the shotgun heavy in her hands. She felt the sting of sweat trickling down her back, the sharp taste of dust in her mouth, but she couldn't bring herself to lower her weapon. Not yet. The street was still, save for the soft rustling of the wind. The horses were gone, their hooves fading into the distance, but Clara's heart didn't stop pounding. It wasn't over yet. She knew that. She glanced over at Wyatt. He stood, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the street. His face was hard, his jaw clenched, but there was something else there too. Something softer, hidden behind the steely resolve. The last of Shaw's men lay scattered on the ground, their bodies crumpled in the dust, but Wyatt didn't relax. Not yet. He wasn't done until he knew they were safe. "Clara," Wyatt said, his voice rough but steady. "You all right?" She nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow, her hand trembling slightly as she lowered the shotgun. She wanted to say something, to reassure him that she was fine, but the words wouldn't come. She felt it all, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, the weight of everything they'd just fought for, and the relief that had settled into her chest now that the fight was over. "I'm fine," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "You?" quote. He didn't answer right away, his gaze still fixed on the quiet street, but then he turned to look at her. His eyes softened, just a little, and he gave a small, tired smile. "I'm still here." Clara allowed herself a brief smile in return, but it quickly faded. They both knew this was only the beginning. Shaw's empire wouldn't fall that easily. She knew he'd come back. He wouldn't let this go. The question wasn't if Shaw would retaliate, but when. "We need to move," Wyatt said, his voice suddenly serious. He holstered his rifle, his eyes already scanning for the next move. "Get inside. Get everyone ready." Clara didn't argue. She turned and made her way back to the boarding house, feeling the tension rise in her chest once again. She heard footsteps behind her and glanced back. Wyatt was right on her heels, his steps quick, his movements sharp. Inside the house, the others were waiting, their faces tense and expectant. Maggie was standing by the stove, her hands steady despite the chaos, while Daniel was pacing near the window, his eyes darting from the street to the door. They all knew the fight wasn't over. They all knew Shaw would come again, and this time, they wouldn't be able to count on Wyatt's quick reflexes to save them. "Everyone all right?" Wyatt asked, his voice low but commanding. Maggie nodded, her eyes narrowing. For now. But I don't expect that to last long. Shaw doesn't take kindly to losing. Daniel looked up from the window, his face grim. He'll come back with more men. We can't keep hiding like this. Clara joined them by the table, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. What did they do next? Where did they go from here? We need to find a way to end this, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Shaw isn't just going to walk away. He'll come after us again, and we need to be ready. Wyatt stepped forward, his hands resting on the table, his gaze sharp. We will be ready, but we need more than just guns and bullets. We need a plan. We need to hit Shaw where it hurts. Clara frowned, not entirely sure what he meant. What do you mean? Quote. Wyatt's eyes met hers, and for the first time that night she saw a flicker of something deeper in them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking control of their lives. Taking control of the future. We go after his business, he said quietly. Shaw's not just some cattle baron. He's got his hands in everything. The land, the water rights, the businesses in this town. We cut off his resources and we cripple him. Clara's mind whirred, the pieces falling into place. But Shaw's got the town under his thumb, the sheriff, the bank. He owns everything. Wyatt nodded, a grim smile forming on his lips. Exactly. That's why we take the fight to him. We don't wait for him to come to us. We go after him first. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, a surge of determination rising in her. This wasn't just about defending her home anymore. This was about taking back control, about making Shaw pay for everything he'd done. She looked around the room at the people who'd become her family in the past few days. Maggie, who had fed her when she was hungry. Daniel, who had stood by her when no one else would. Wyatt, who had come into her life like a storm and now stood at her side, ready to fight. We do this together, Clara said, her voice fierce. We take Shaw down, and we make sure he never hurts anyone again. Wyatt's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, they both stood there, the weight of what they were about to do hanging between them. It wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. It was a fight for their future, for their right to live freely in a world that had been shaped by Shaw's greed and corruption. We start tomorrow, Wyatt said quietly, his voice low and determined. We get to work, and we don't stop until this is done. Clara nodded, her heart still pounding in her chest, but now it was for a different reason. The fight had just begun, and this time they wouldn't back down. Tomorrow, she repeated softly, we end this. As they made plans for the day ahead, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. This wasn't just about Shaw anymore. This was about reclaiming everything he had stolen from them. It was about finding justice and peace, and maybe, just maybe, about finally putting the past behind them. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to spill through the window when Clara sat down at the table, her mind already working through the details of their plan. She glanced up at Wyatt, who was standing by the door, his face a mask of determination. Tomorrow would be the start of something new, a new chapter, a new fight. And Clara would be ready. The morning came too quickly, the soft orange glow of sunrise spilling through the window as Clara sat at the table, hands clenched around a cup of coffee she barely tasted. It had been hours since they'd finalized their plans, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that everything was hanging by a thin thread. Shaw's men had been scattered, but they weren't defeated. The threat was still looming, and it felt closer now than it ever had before. Wyatt's absence weighed heavy in the house. After a brief breakfast, he'd gone out to make preparations, checking the fences and ensuring the horses were ready for what was coming. The rest of the house was eerily quiet, save for the soft clatter of pots in the kitchen where Maggie was preparing their meal. Clara stood and moved toward the back door, the cool morning air brushing against her face as she stepped outside. The world felt different now, familiar and yet foreign, like she was on the edge of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the fight against Shaw, it was the weight of everything they had been through, the choices, the risks, the lives that had been altered, including her own. Clara. The voice pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to find Daniel standing at the edge of the porch. His face was set with a determination that mirrored her own, though there was a wariness in his eyes. He had grown in the past few days, matured somehow, but there was still the boy in him, the one who was too young to carry the weight of this fight. "What is it?" she asked, crossing the porch to meet him. Daniel took a breath, his gaze flicking to the distance where Wyatt had gone. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. I've been trying to pretend like I am, but I don't know, Clara. It's a lot to take on." Clara's heart softened at the sight of him. She had seen this boy grow up too quickly, forced to face the weight of the world, far too young. He had lost his father, and now his brother-in-law, someone who had become a part of the fabric of their lives in such a short time. "You're ready, Daniel. You have been for a while now," she said, her voice steady. "It's okay to be scared. It's okay to not know everything. But you're here, and that's what matters." Daniel's gaze dropped to the ground, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not sure I can protect you. Not like Wyatt does." Clara stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've already protected us. Every time you've stood by me, every time you've fought to keep this place safe, you've protected us. You're stronger than you know." Quote. Daniel looked up at her, his eyes still uncertain but filled with something else, something like courage. "I'll do my part," he said, his voice a little more certain than before. "That's all we can do," Clara replied with a small smile. "Do our part." As Daniel nodded and moved away, Clara's thoughts returned to Wyatt. He had always been the strong, silent type, but there was something about him that had drawn her in, something in the way he moved through the world like a man who had nothing left to lose. His past, his pain, it was all there in his eyes, but he had never allowed it to consume him. Instead, he had thrown himself into their fight, into their struggle, as if saving them was his final redemption. And maybe, in a way, it was. But Clara wasn't blind to the cost. She knew Wyatt was broken. He hadn't healed from the war, hadn't healed from losing his fiancée. The man who had ridden into Dusty Springs looking for flour and coffee had found more than he expected. He had found her. But now, she couldn't help but wonder if he was still running. Running from the past, running from his demons. But that was a question for later. For now, there was work to do. By the time Wyatt returned, the town had started to stir. Dusty Springs was a small place, quiet on most days. But today was different. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something was about to break. Wyatt stood in the doorway, his dark eyes scanning the room, his features unreadable as always. "We ready?" he asked, his voice low. Clara nodded. "As ready as we'll ever be." Wyatt moved into the room, his presence filling the space as he crossed to the table, pulling out a chair and sitting down. His gaze turned to the map they had been using, lines of red ink marking the roads, the supply routes, and the locations where they would make their stand. The plan was simple, but the risks were high. "We'll strike at noon," Wyatt said, looking at each of them in turn. "When Shaw's men are most likely to be scattered. When they're expecting us to be vulnerable. We won't give them a chance to regroup." Maggie, who had been sitting in the corner listening, spoke up. "I've been thinking about that. If Shaw's men are coming from the east, we'll need someone to keep them distracted to the west. We need to hit them from both sides." Clara thought for a moment, her fingers tapping against the table as she tried to work through the details. "We've got Daniel and me on the western flank. I can take out a few men if I have the chance. You and Wyatt should focus on the east. You've both got the firepower we need." Wyatt's gaze met hers, a quiet understanding passing between them. "You sure about this?" Quote. Clara didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." It was as if everything had fallen into place. They had no other choice, no more waiting, no more hiding. If Shaw wanted a fight, he would get it. But they were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting for everything Shaw had taken from them, everything he had tried to steal. Wyatt leaned forward, his hands braced against the table. "We move at first light. I'll lead the charge to the east, and you and Daniel will cover us from the west. Once we've got Shaw's men in position, we'll hit them hard." Quote, The plan was dangerous, but Clara felt the confidence in Wyatt's voice settle in her chest like a steady rhythm. They were ready. This was their chance to end it all, to take Shaw's empire apart piece by piece. "You know what to do," Wyatt said, his gaze lingering on each of them. "No matter what happens, don't stop, don't let up." Maggie stood, a determined look in her eyes. "We won't." And just like that, the quiet of Dusty Springs was shattered. The town was no longer the peaceful, sun-baked place it had been just days ago. Now it was a battlefield. As Clara walked toward the door, her thoughts briefly flashed to the future she had always imagined. One where she wasn't always fighting, where she wasn't always looking over her shoulder. For the first time in a long while, she could see a life without fear. A life with Wyatt by her side. But first, they had to finish this. As the door closed behind her, Clara felt the weight of everything shift. They were about to take the fight to Shaw. No more hiding, no more running. Just one final stand. And this time, they wouldn't lose. The first rays of dawn broke over Dusty Springs, casting long shadows across the dusty street as Clara stood at the edge of the porch, the weight of the moment heavy on her shoulders. The plan was in motion. It had to work. There was no other option. Her eyes scanned the horizon, where the early morning light kissed the land, still untouched by the storm that was about to hit. She could hear the sounds of the town stirring, the faint murmur of voices, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. It was the calm before the storm, a storm that would change everything. Clara. Wyatt's voice pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to find him standing behind her, fully dressed, his rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was still pale from the previous night's blood loss, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The fight had ignited something in him, just as it had in her. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Clara nodded, forcing a calm she didn't entirely feel. "As ready as I'll ever be." He moved toward her, his hand reaching for hers. For a brief moment their fingers brushed, and Clara felt a warmth that steadied her, grounding her in the present. They weren't just fighting for their own survival anymore. They were fighting for the future. For each other. "Let's finish this," Wyatt said, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze locked with hers, an unspoken promise hanging between them. They walked together toward the stables, where Daniel was waiting with the horses. The others were already in position, preparing for the battle that would determine the fate of Dusty Springs. Every second felt like a ticking clock, the minutes slipping by faster than Clara could count them. She glanced around, her mind racing through the plan once more. They were outnumbered, but they had something Shaw didn't. Unity. They were fighting for each other, for their homes, for the lives they wanted to build. Shaw had nothing left to lose. They had everything. As Wyatt mounted his horse, Clara's heart skipped a beat. This was it. There would be no turning back after this. She took a deep breath and swung up onto her own horse, her body stiff with anticipation. "You know the plan," Wyatt said, his voice steady as he adjusted his reins. "We'll draw them east, keep them occupied long enough for you and Daniel to hit them from the west." Clara gave him a determined nod. "We won't miss our mark." Daniel was already on his horse, ready to ride. "Let's make this count," he said, his voice sharp with the edge of someone who had seen too much too young. Wyatt turned his attention to the horizon, where they knew Shaw's men were waiting, gathering for their attack. "Move out," he commanded. And with that, the quiet of Dusty Springs shattered. Clara spurred her horse forward, the wind whipping through her hair as she raced toward the western edge of town, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't just running to survive anymore. She was running toward something, toward a future she could finally call her own. She could hear the sounds of gunfire in the distance, the sharp crack of shots cutting through the air. Her instincts kicked in. They were close. She glanced over her shoulder to find Daniel at her side, his face hard with determination. She didn't need to say anything. They knew their roles. They knew what had to be done. Ahead, Wyatt and the others were drawing Shaw's men into position. Their horses kicked up dust as they raced through the streets, the sound of hooves echoing through the empty town. It was chaos, but it was controlled. Every move was calculated. Every step was part of the plan. And then, As they reached the edge of town, it happened. A shout rang out from the east. Wyatt's voice carried through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Now!" Clara and Daniel wheeled their horses around, charging down the western side of town, the distance between them and Shaw's men closing quickly. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of everything they had fought for building to this one moment. Then, with a sharp crack, the first shot rang out. The sound echoed in Clara's ears as the chaos erupted around her. The first volley of gunfire was followed by another, and another, until the air was thick with the sound of battle. Clara ducked low as a bullet whizzed past her ear, her horse skidding slightly as she took cover behind a building. Daniel was right beside her, his rifle raised and ready. "Stay low," Clara said, her voice steady as she peered around the corner. "We can't let them regroup." Daniel nodded, his eyes focused. "On your mark." Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself as the chaos continued around them. She knew they had only one shot at this. They couldn't afford to miss. Then, just as Shaw's men were turning their attention to the east, Clara and Daniel struck. Together they charged out of cover, rifles raised, firing with precision. The first shot took down one of Shaw's men, and the second sent another tumbling to the ground. The rest of the men scrambled, trying to regroup, but it was too late. They were already surrounded. From the corner of her eye, Clara saw Wyatt and the others closing in, their rifles trained on Shaw's remaining men. The tide was turning. Clara's heart raced as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Shaw's empire was crumbling. One by one his men were taken down, their resistance fading as they realized they had been outmatched. But Shaw wasn't finished yet. Clara's pulse quickened as she saw him. He was standing at the center of the chaos, his face twisted with rage, his hand gripping the handle of a gun. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. With a final, desperate shout, Shaw drew his weapon, aiming for Wyatt. Clara's heart leapt in her chest as she saw what was about to happen. Time seemed to slow. She didn't think. She just acted. With a steady hand, Clara raised her rifle and took the shot. The bullet struck Shaw's gun hand, sending his weapon flying to the ground. He fell to his knees, his face contorted in pain and disbelief. Clara didn't wait for him to recover. She dismounted, her boots hitting the dirt with a sharp thud as she moved toward him, her gun trained on his chest. "You're finished, Shaw," she said, her voice cold and steady. Shaw looked up at her, his eyes filled with fury. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" Clara didn't flinch. "I know we have." With that, the final fight was over. Shaw's men were either captured or fled, and Shaw himself was taken into custody. The sound of his defeat echoed through the streets of Dusty Springs. For the first time in 2 years, Clara felt the weight of fear and uncertainty lift. The battle had been long and hard, but they had won. And as she looked at Wyatt, standing beside her, she realized that in the end, they had found something more valuable than just survival. They had found each other. And for the first time, Clara felt something inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The sun was setting as Wyatt pulled her close, his arms strong around her. "We did it, Clara. We made it." Clara smiled, a soft, contented smile that reached her eyes. "We did." And for the first time in years, Clara knew that tomorrow was a new day, a day filled with possibility. A day where she and Wyatt could finally begin to live the life they had fought so hard for. Together.